Taking a flight on an airplane can be a uncomfortable journey, as you're squeezed in like sardines and coach just to save a few bucks. Who knows who you might sit next to? Usually they're obnoxious or asleep, but what if you met someone that brought changes into your life you may have never imagined?
What's that? You want to be scared? Come with me. You will experience tales of horror, ghosts, and death. It is not recommended for the weak at heart. Listen in the dark. It's more fun that way. This is Weekly Spooky.
Hello, my spookies. It's Wednesday, and you know what that means. It's time for a little spooky in your weekly. I'm your host and narrator, Enrique Couto, and we have quite the chilling tale of flying in the sky. We'll be getting to that in just a little bit, but first I want to say a sincere, very sincere thank you to everyone who's been listening and writing in. Last week I told you all about losing my dog, Henwolf, and it's been really hard. She used to lay right next to my feet every single time I recorded the show, and I do mean every single time. And it's a hard adjustment without her. But I am happy and thankful to be here to entertain all of you, and I am so grateful for all the well wishes and kindness you guys have shown me. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. And if you love what we're doing here and you want to show some support to Weekly Spooky, the easiest way to do that is to go to your favorite podcasting app like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or really wherever you get your podcasts. It does help a lot. And if you want to support the show very, very directly, please consider heading to weeklyspooky.com and clicking on Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you get 2 bonus shows every single month, and they're tied into our Strickfield universe. They're the long game. They are novel-length stories, so you definitely get a big bang for your buck. But now, my friends, we better hurry. We have a flight, and time is of the essence, so get into the terminal. Funny name, by the way, calling it a terminal, isn't it? Well, make sure you get to your gate, because you do not want to be left behind on this flight. We'll get to that after these quick words from our sponsors. The Last Flight Out by Charles Campbell. Zone 1 is boarding. Everyone with a boarding pass in Zone 1 are cleared to board Flight 752 from Hartsfield-Jackson International to Seattle. Please present your boarding pass and be prepared to have carry-ons checked if they will not fit in the overhead compartment or under your seat. The pretty petite blonde wearing the Delta name tag smiled as passengers lined up to board the 284-passenger ready Boeing 757-300. Sheila popped out her earbuds. The sounds of Maria Maria by Santana emitted from the tiny dangling speakers, and took another glance at her boarding pass, hoping it would magically change zones from 4 to 1. She had 2 carry-ons, and if her luck was per usual, she would end up checking the overhead bag because a few inconsiderate passengers would overstuff their allotments, leaving most of zones 3 and 4 in the baggage lurch. The airport was crowded with your typical mix of people. Business types with iPads and laptops in hand, stressed out parents herding up their children, and more than a couple of people that Sheila prayed would not be seated beside her because they would overlap over a quarter of the way into her economy class seat. Another 10 minutes passed before Sheila heard the sweet sound of, "Now boarding Zone 4. Sheila made her way past the smiling blonde that scanned her boarding pass and was pleasantly surprised that she wasn't asked to check her carry-ons as she cleared the entrance ramp and stepped into the jetliner. Okay, 22C, Sheila mumbled as she held her laptop bag out in front of her with the duffel bag dangling behind as she navigated down the middle aisle, finding her window seat. This really is my lucky day, Sheila thought to herself, as she was one of the last passengers to board. In the compartment right above her seat, there was a hole just big enough to stuff her duffel bag, leaving her laptop to be shoved under the seat in front of her. Sheila took her seat, strapped her belt, and was asleep before the flight attendant gave instructions on emergency exits and safety belts. This is the captain speaking. We have now achieved an altitude of 10,000 feet. You may now use approved electronic devices. Please keep your seatbelts fastened. Thank you for flying Delta Flight 752 to Seattle. Hi, dear. I hope I didn't wake you. A spindly old man reached across the middle seat and gently tapped on Sheila's arm. She turned to look upon the smiling elderly man whose hand was still gently placed on her shoulder. His were the hands of a man who'd seen their share of hard labor, the hands of a man that had been on top of many a roof on many a hot summer's day. No, sir, you didn't wake me. My name's Sheila Baker, she said as she patted the man's fingers on her right shoulder with her left hand. I'm Otis Thornton. The skinny 70-something smiled at Sheila with teeth that, to her surprise, appeared to be all his, 100%, and not a spot of yellow on them. Pleased to meet you, Mr. Otis interrupted. No, mister. Just Otis. Sheila smiled and said, Okay, Otis. Looks like we have a little breathing room, huh? Sheila patted the empty seat that separated them. Not that it would have made that much of a difference if he was sitting in the seat right next to her. Otis was a little over 5'6", and couldn't have been any more than 125 pounds soaking wet. He was immediately engaging with light green eyes that shouted kindness. Sheila had to stop herself from reaching out and touching the full head of neatly combed snow-white hair. Oh, the pleasure is all mine, Otis started. I don't get to sit beside beautiful women that much anymore. Well, not since I lost my dearest Ella. The kind eyes told a story that Sheila desperately wanted to hear. Otis, I must say that I am pleased that you will be my company on this flight. Sheila shuffled in her seat so she was facing Otis directly and pushed a strand of her hanging brown hair back behind her left ear. Well, thank you, Sheila. I'm an old man that likes to talk. Just let me know if I start to talk your ears off and I'll be quiet. Well, thank you, Otis. I'm a 32-year-old woman that likes to listen, so talk all you want. You might regret that invitation, Sheila. Otis's eyes lit up with the prospect of sharing his story with her. Try me. Okay, here it goes. And Otis began. It was the summer of 1958 when I first laid eyes on Ella Stanton. She was working at the Snowcap as a roller waitress, and she was very good at it. I remember hearing the wheels of the skates whisk by on the asphalt as she left behind a sweet trail of lightly applied perfume while she rolled to and fro and back and forth. Her auburn hair was like a campfire at sunset, and her skin was fair and as soft as a butterfly's kiss. At least as soft as how I like to imagine a butterfly's kiss. I was a young man of 23 when she first smiled and batted her brown eyes at me. You see, I helped my father back in those days. He was a self-made, hard-working man. Otis Thornton Sr. moved to Augusta, Georgia with my mother, Jeannie, when I was a toddler way back in the early 40s. I take after my father in the way that I'm built. Spindly and all, but I have my mother's face and my hair used to be sandy blonde in another lifetime. Anyway, back to my angel. I remember my hands ached like the Dickens from laying shingles on that hot July day when Ella rolled into my life. I remember that I ordered a double cheeseburger all the way and a Coke float when Ella said, "You sure are skinny. You think you can handle the double?" Did I mention my father was there with me? Well, he was, and he answered for me because my mouth couldn't speak the words outside of the order that I had just blurted out. Yeah, I've seen him eat 4 thick pork chops with just as many mashed taters at home and still be hungry, young lady. My father gave her an Eastwood squint with a turned-up grin and continued. I'll have the same thing, but I'll take the Coke without the float. From that day on, I visited Ella at least 3 times a week, mostly without my father, although he would still come along once in a while when he got the craving for the goodness of that double burger. This went along for about 2 or 3 months before I got up the courage to court Ella. My father told Mother about Ella about 2 weeks into me missing too many home-cooked meals. Then they were both on to me. My mother wanted grandchildren as I was an only child. There was something about her lady parts that didn't quite work right after I was born. I remember that she doted over me enough for 4 children, so much as a boy all the way up to and through manhood. Ella's mother, Lucille, is where she got that auburn hair and fair skin. Her father, Thomas Stanton, worked at the True Value hardware store selling hammers, wrenches, nails, and whatnot. All Ella got from him was the brown eyes. I remember them staring through me the first time I came calling on his youngest daughter. Ella had 2 older sisters that, at the time, were already married off. Janice to some businessman named Earl, and, if I recall correctly, Francine who married a butcher named Steve or Sam. Something that started with an S. Anyway, Ella was the last chickadee left, and Daddy Hawk certainly favored her over the 2 that had flown the coop. Lucille took to me right away, but Thomas Stanton took a lot of coaxing. He had to meet my father to gauge my stock and upbringing. I could tell from our first handshake that he favored the callus that had developed on my hand. He knew from that first shake that I didn't have the hands of a paper pusher or, God forbid, an insurance salesman. Mr. Stanton knew I came by an honest wage from the sweat of my brow. That was a win for me right up front. Even with that, it still took coaxing. Sheila, I hope I'm not boring you so far. Otis, not at all. It's the opposite. I don't want you to stop until you tell me everything. It's a long flight and your story has me hooked. Sheila could feel the stress of her life melting away as she listened to the tale of Otis and Ella. Okay then. And Otis continued. So Ella and I married almost a year after I met her father for the first time. About a year after that, we welcomed our baby girl, Marilyn, into the world. Marilyn turned out to be a pediatrician. All of my work on all those roofs with my father did that. That's something I'm very proud of. Ella's father never saw our second child, Otis. He died of a heart attack in his backyard weeding when Ella was pregnant with little Otis. We went back and forth on the name for a bit, but my father wanted to keep the Otis name going. And the truth of it was, Thomas Stanton wasn't around to object, and my lovely mother-in-law, Lucille, well, she just fell to pieces, and her baby girl, my wife, my sweet Ella, wasn't far behind on the falling to pieces train. On top of it, she was pregnant with little Otis with a toddler at her feet, and the stress of it all was almost more than she could bear. To tell the truth, looking back on it now, it was. And I know this may sound selfish, almost more than I should have been able to bear. But my father raised a pillar of strength, and that's not just me boasting, my dear. I truly was like a block of granite in those days. Thomas's funeral was on September 22nd in 1962, and little Otis was born just 2 days later on the 24th. In those days, folks hadn't heard of anything like postpartum depression. We just called it the baby blues, and Ella's father passing combined with it didn't give little Otis much of a chance. I just didn't know it back then. Ella's sisters came down for the funeral, but they sure didn't hang around to comfort Lucille, let alone the birth of their new nephew. I guess they were grieving in their own way, but they sure as hell got out of Dodge before the soil in their father's grave had even settled. I think the guy whose first name began with an S was behind Francine's early departure. I just don't think Janice was strong enough to hang around a minute longer than she felt was required. It was a few months after little Otis was born that Lucille started to come out of it, and it was all due to little Otis. The baby blues and grief still had its lock on my darling Ella. I had to keep food on the table, so I stayed on rooftops with my father. My mother kept little Otis about a quarter of the time, and Lucille kept him the rest of the time. My mother could see that Lucille needed that baby more than she did, and although I could see it hurt her to give up her time with little Otis, she knew if Lucille couldn't hang on to that baby, then she wouldn't be far behind Mr. Stanton taking up residence in Bellevue Memorial Gardens. A big thing that helped was Mother did spend a lot of time with sweet Marilyn. Sheila, next is the hard part. You still want to listen?
Otis, I don't know what to say.
Sheila was transfixed on the old man with the green eyes and calloused hands. Just then, flight attendant Susie Q from who knows where interrupted them. Peanuts or cookies? Excuse me? Sheila asked because absolutely nothing flight attendant Susie Q said registered in her brain. Otis smiled with all his real teeth on display and said, I like the salty peanuts. Please, and a Coke if you've got one in that cart. I do, replied Susie Q. Miss, anything for you? Sheila answered, salty peanuts and a Coke. Otis tipped the red and white can in Sheila's direction as Susie Q rattled by, and he asked, Shall I continue? Yes. Sheila was too far in now. She had to hear the rest of it. And Otis continued. Little Otis had the colic pretty bad, and I was up many a night tending to him because of Ella's delicate state. My days with Father always started early, and with little Otis, if I could get 4 straight hours of good sleep on any given night, that was a blessing. Most nights it was closer to 3 hours, and sometimes 2. It was November 18th, and it started with a cold rain. Ella was clearing up the supper dishes. Marilyn was playing with her dolls on the living room floor, and little Otis was fast asleep on my belly as I watched Cronkite fill us in on the state of the world. I can still recall the smell of a fresh rain cropping up, and then the steady pelting on the roof. Before Cronkite signed off, I was in the firm grip of the Sandman. When I awoke, little Otis was no longer taking breaths on my chest. At first I thought nothing of it. Ella had taken him to his crib and put him down for the night. A fresh-faced Carson was in the middle of cracking a joke when I turned the knob on the old Zenith. I walked up the stairs to our bedroom, and I was just as careful and quiet as I could be with every step. I had just gotten a gift in the few hours of sleep I had received in front of the television, and if I was quiet, that night was going to be a 6 or 7 hour snooze-a-thon for me. I stopped just outside of little Otis's door and pushed it open, when a very real and sudden sense of dread filled my body. Sheila, this is where I could have made a difference. If I had only known. Ella was sitting in the rocker facing the window in the far corner of little Otis's room. The fire truck red-painted walls made it very dark at night. I remember the sound of the rocker as it moved front and back while Ella gently rocked little Otis. The window was cracked just a hair, and a little chill filled the room, but Ella just kept rocking with little Otis in her arms. I thought maybe she had finally gotten over the baby blues. I remember that I smiled, relieved that my sense of dread was a false alarm, and closed the door as quietly as I had opened it, and did a bed check on Marilyn. She was curled up with her Raggedy Ann doll, thumb firmly placed in her mouth. So I went to bed.
Don't go away. Weekly Spooky will be right back.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are about to experience some severe turbulence. Please remain seated with your belts fastened until further notice. It's going to get pretty choppy, so make sure your belongings are secured. Thank you for flying Delta Flight 752 to Seattle. The flight attendants made a quick walk down the aisles, tugging on seatbelts, flipping up tray tables, and checking in with the folks seated at the emergency exits to make sure that they were still willing and able to perform their assigned duties, if needed. All of a sudden, as if on cue, the 757 shuddered violently. It sounded like it was getting nailed with 1,000,000 paintballs and took a sudden drop in elevation. Flight attendant Susie Q shrieked as she momentarily left her feet and, if the drop had been just a couple more feet, her head would have been caved in by the plane's ceiling. Another stroke of luck for Susie Q was that she brushed up against the aisle seat that sure-handed Otis occupied. As weight and momentum took her up, Otis grabbed her by the waistband in her skirt with his steel grip and pulled her back down. Susie Q fell hard on both knees from the sudden descent, but it was preferable to smashing her skull. She crawled on hands and knees until she got to her seat. Her knees were all skint up, and blood was oozing from the stocking hose, but she made it to her seat and secured her safety belt. The creaking and cracking noises inside the flying capsule started to subside as the turbulence began to settle.
This is the captain speaking. We aren't out of the woods yet. I anticipate we'll hit more chop before we settle back in. Remain seated with your seatbelts fastened, please.
Otis, are you okay? What you did there, catching that girl, that was amazing. Sheila was falling in love with her elderly companion. I'm fine, dear. I've been on many of these flights in my lifetime, and I've seen worse. We'll be fine. I was on a plane that almost crashed once, but that's another story. You want me to keep going? There's more to tell about me and Ella. Otis gazed at Sheila with, "You have to let me finish the story" eyes. I would like to hear the rest. What happened to baby Otis? I rolled out of bed and remembered it felt like I stepped on 1,000 sewing needles standing at attention on the hardwood floor. My hands might have 70-plus years of callus, but my feet are still tender to this day. Ella was lying there, still lost in her dreams as I shuffled across the floor to grab my bathrobe. I generally slept in my undershorts and nothing else. It was colder than usual that morning, and the reason was apparent when I pulled the robe over my shoulders. The window on the left side of our bedroom was fully opened, and there was a little puddle on the floor directly underneath. So I closed the source of the morning's frosty rise and turned back to find a towel. I remember moving into the hallway, looking just a moment to check in on Marilyn, and she was still nestled under her blankets, so I continued down the hallway toward the towel closet. Just before I got there, I noticed that the door to little Otis's room was completely closed. We never left the door to his room completely closed, so this got my attention right quick. My breath got shorter the closer that I moved to little Otis's door. The white knob seemed to look at me, daring me to turn it. But, almost warning me not to, I hesitated as I expected it to grow a mouth and say, "Otis, I wouldn't turn me if I were you." But I did turn it. And then I stepped in. Every window in the room was wide open. All 4 of them. The room was a literal icebox. Water was everywhere, much more than any single towel could pick up. Water splashed under my feet as I sprinted toward little Otis's crib. I slipped in the water when I made a stubborn stop, and both my feet flung out from underneath me. I landed with my ass on the floor and my feet sticking out from under the crib. I grabbed the bottom of the crib rail and pulled myself up, shedding the soaked bathrobe as I did. His little green eyes were staring up at me, and his mouth was slightly open as if he were still trying to suckle. I reached down to grab my son, and his blue body was cold and stiff. I'll never forget the sound it made when I pulled my blanket-wrapped baby from the crib mattress. It was almost like the sound of pulling apart Velcro. I was looking into little Otis's hungry eyes when I heard Ella mumble, "I'm sorry," in the doorway. Sheila, this was all my fault. It really was. I knew better than to leave her alone with little Otis the night before. Lack of sleep overruled rational thinking. Not that I'm using that as an excuse, because I'd gotten a good chunk of sleep for me that night before I went to bed. I never turned to look at her. I recall saying that I would take care of it, and she needed to leave the room while she still could. She was wailing as she walked back down the hallway. Little Marilyn was still snuggled in her blankets. "Oh my God, Otis! What did you do?" Sheila's hands were trembling at this point, but she didn't notice. Otis had her all the way in. "Well, Sheila, I loved my Ella more than anything. And this is awful to say out loud, but I loved Ella even more than little Otis or Marilyn, and I would give my life without question for any of them." The plane suddenly dropped again, and the lights in the flying pillbox flickered. The sounds of nervous passengers rose, and there was the cry of a baby somewhere about 10 rows up. The plane rattled like chattering teeth. The flight attendants were breezing through the aisles, holding the sides of the seats as they moved through, trying to make sure that all the passengers were secured.
This is the captain speaking. The chop we're experiencing is severe. Everyone, remain seated, flight attendants included. Everyone in your seat and stay there. If you have to use the restroom, I would suggest you hold it if at all possible. This turbulence is unpredictable, and we aren't out of it yet.
No, thank you for flying with Delta Flight 752 after this update. This update was to keep your ass in your seat and don't move, so says El Capitan. Otis? Sheila reached out and grabbed him by the tips of his fingers with both of her hands. "Please, finish the story." "Are you sure, dear? I hear some fear in the captain's voice now, so he has my attention." Otis pulled both of her hands into his, and Sheila nodded her head yes, and Otis continued. "Lucille was at the funeral, and she said maybe 2 words to me the entire time she was there. There was definitely blame in her eyes, and it was always directed at me. I suspect that she went to her grave thinking I killed that baby. And in a way, she was kind of right. My father and mother were there. My father never left my side for a second. My mother was all over the place. She was babbling incoherently for most of the service and clung to my father's shoulders like a frightened kitten. My father stayed stoic and strong for me, to show me how to be a man. I appreciated that more than he ever knew. Neither one of Ella's sisters showed up. I'm sure Mr. S. had something to do with Francine's no-show. Janice, I never knew why she didn't make it. Marilyn was still a toddler, and she noticed her baby brother was gone, but she was still young enough to forget. There was a brief investigation, but the baby's death was determined to be accidental, bordering on negligence, and charges were within an eyelash of being filed. There were questions on why the windows were cracked. They were all just cracked when the investigators showed up, and there wasn't a drop of water on the floor. The windows even being cracked just a little in an enclosed space with no heat was enough to kill an infant when temperatures dropped the way they had. The reason given for the cracked windows was the strong scent of pine, a scent that I made sure was there when they showed up. Remember, I loved Ella more than anything, and I was going to protect her at all costs, even if that meant going to prison. After the funeral, Lucille showed up on Christmas, Thanksgiving, and a couple of Marilyn's birthdays, but every time she laid her eyes on me, I could feel the flames of her hate. Then, all at once, we lost contact with her. She moved away in the night one day, and we never heard from her again. To this day, I don't know where she ended up or where she's buried. I suppose in this day and age I could find out, but why raise old ghosts? I had a long talk with Ella, and after that, We only spoke about little Otis every September 24th. We'd get a cake, candles, and say a prayer for our lost child. We shared the celebration with Marilyn every year, but as far as she was concerned, her brother's death was a tragic accident. I saw Janice and Francine a couple more times before I lost Ella, and both times weren't planned. Janice was passing through Augusta with her businessman husband and popped in both times. Francine came to get away from Mr. S., the butcher, once, and she came looking to borrow money one other time. Then, about this time last year, I lost Ella. Oxygen masks dropped and people were screaming and crying on the 757. The plane was in a sharp descent, and for Otis and Sheila, everything seemed to be moving in slow motion. "Sheila, do you hear the baby?" Otis screamed over the commotion. The oxygen masks were floating in front of his face. "Otis, put on your mask!" Sheila screamed, leaning over, discarding the rule to put your own mask on before helping others. Otis swatted her hands away. "Sheila, I have to get the baby!" Otis screamed as he unbuckled his safety belt. It sounded like a freight train was barreling down the track, positioned to take them out. Heads were tucked between knees, flight attendants were screaming at people to remain seated. The plane was almost in a full dive. Otis pulled himself from the floor with his strong hands and moved from seat to seat. The sounds of babies' cries got closer with each seat he passed. Most people were praying. Some had their phones out, texting or trying to call their loved ones. He could hear Sheila screaming behind him, begging him to come back. But Otis pressed on. He was there. Otis gripped the side of seat A and looked into the green eyes staring back at him. Little Otis smiled at his father, and his father smiled back. Otis kept his grip on the front of the seat with his right hand and unbuckled the child with his left. He lifted his son close to him. All of the screams went away. He could only hear Sheila. Otis turned and, holding his son in one hand, made his way back to seat 22A. The pilots were both unconscious. The cabin pressure alarm went unnoticed as they tried to get the plane back on course, and it was too late when they fell into La La Land. "Sheila, meet my son, little Otis." "What? How?" Sheila started. There was a bright flash of light, and all of the shadows burned away into the white. The plane exploded into the side of the Cascade Mountains, just outside of Seattle. Then Sheila awoke, and it began again. "Hi, dear. I hope I didn't wake you." A spindly old hand reached across the middle seat and gently tapped on Sheila's arm as she turned to look upon the smiling elderly man, still touching her. His hands were the hands of a man who had seen their fair share of hard labor, the hands of a man that had been on top of many a roof on many a hot summer's day. Bellevue Memorial Gardens, Augusta, Georgia. Ella and Marilyn were at Otis and little Otis's graveside. Marilyn was standing behind her mother's wheelchair with a hand on her frail mother's shoulder. It had been a little over a year since they lost Otis in that horrible plane crash, and Otis had lost Ella and Marilyn. "Marilyn, I have something to tell you," Ella started. "What is it, Mother?" asked Marilyn. "Let's go to the snow cap, and I'll share it all." Ella wiped a tear from her eye. "Okay, Mother. Goodbye, Daddy and baby brother. I love you." Marilyn pushed the wheelchair up the incline. As they passed, a middle-aged couple smiled as they walked by holding hands. The tall man and his wife stopped 2 plots away from Otis and little Otis. The marker read, Sheila Alice Baker. A bright light that will never burn out. February 28th, 1980 to November 18th, 2012. Well, my friends, it turns out that flight was going somewhere none of us could have truly imagined. Big thank you to our good buddy Charles Campbell for the truly chilling story we had tonight. And I'll be thinking about it quite a bit the next time I buy a plane ticket to go somewhere and explore the world. Well, my spookies, I really appreciate all of you for standing by me while I've had a very hard start of the year. In the last 2.5 months, I lost both of my dogs. They were both seniors, and they were well taken care of, very well taken care of. They were my pride and joy, and I loved them so much, so it's hard, but I do enjoy bringing you this show. It brings me a lot of joy. So don't worry, your spooky will not stop. And a reminder, if you want to support us, head over to weeklyspooky.com and click on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. You make a big difference on the show, you'll join 102 other spookies and get 2 episodes every single month to enjoy. And if you want to be a bit more of a high roller, you can join the Patreon podcast boosters. Those are folks who pay just a little bit more to hear their names at the end of the show. And they are Johnny Nix, John Callan, Bobbletopia.com, Jenny Green, Brent McCullough, Karen Weemet, Jack Kerr, and Craig Cohen. Hey, Craig! Craig came and visited us during the eclipse on Monday. Had a lot of fun. It was cool to finally meet you in person, Craig. You're welcome back to Dayton anytime you want. If you want to join them, just go to weeklyspooky.com, click on Patreon, and select any tier at $15 or higher. You'll hear your name at the end of our show, and you'll get that undying gratitude. And if you want to hang out with us on Facebook, just type in Weekly Spookies Tomb of Terror on your Facebook search bar. Hang out with all the spookies and share your favorite memes, scares, jokes, whatever you have. But now, I gotta get out of here. So, until next time, for myself, for my producer Dan Wilder, my executive producers Rob Fields and Mark Shields, and my composer Ray Mattis, talk at you later.
Thank you for listening. Make sure to find your way back next week. But for now, you are safe. Trust me.